So you'll see the loops, and that's how we begin to figure out that the jets, leaving the persistent contrails, which turned into these heavy plumes and cross-hatching, were actually the ones that were the intraflights that were moving around. But we had very few that flew over Mendocino County itself, so the commercial airline impact for our county is so small here, absolutely so small, that there wouldn't be the type of impact from seeing many persistent jet contrails from them, and they fly straight. They never loop. The jets around us look like racetracks sometimes, where they're going in an oval around the county, or they're going over the Pacific Ocean, over to Lake County, and back. So they're traveling across many counties in these circular patterns. And this was the first time I had the FAA representation to show this particular endeavor. Okay, this area here, right here, is Mendocino County, Sonoma County on one side, and Humboldt County on the other side. So, but this area here, you could see that the majority of the jet traffic in the green and the red is not covering and not going across our county. So it's mostly free of commercial air traffic. Now, the yellow here are what they call intraflights. And this is where they go in all directions. Now, there are no flights which leave Sacramento to the east of us that fly out over the Pacific. No commercial flights. So therefore, the intraflights go in this direction. They go towards Sacramento. They go in all directions. But you can see the big loop pattern here, which would give you, if they were leaving persistent jet contrails that persisted, then you would see these different loops. Other jet patterns loop around the county like this. So we started to see that from this map, we learned that intraflights couldn't possibly be commercial airlines because they'd be using so much fuel and they'd be off their schedule. And so because when you get on a flight, they say so much time and you go straight. You don't loop and loop and loop unless there's a weather problem at an airport or something. But this is way too far away for them to be looping into the San Francisco Bay Area, which is way down here. So, and these loops are way out of their range for being in any type of feeding pattern to San Francisco, Oakland, or San Jose. So this is when I first learned about intraflights, but this is also when I confirmed that there wasn't much air traffic over Mendocino County. So this made us unique in being able to look at the phenomenon of persistent jet contrails and know that when the jets were going in certain directions, it wouldn't be any type of commercial patterns. So that's why we knew that the big jets flying, and the big ones we really saw all of the time, many of them unmarked or not clearly marked, were part of this interflight pattern that you can see on this map. Persistent jet contrails that persist and stay in the environment for up to 20 hours. This is like geoengineering. It means that you're artificially, man-made in some way, changing our environment. You're adding particulates, you're adding something to the atmosphere, and it's more deliberate than not, but what you can add is you can add particles and chemicals. Weather modification is geoengineering, making it rain somewhere where it normally wouldn't. So we have all of these things where we talk about geoengineering. The interesting part of geoengineering is that it's now being proposed as a way to put particulates in the atmosphere so that we can stop the direct sunlight from reaching the Earth. It means that they could add particles, iron particles to the ocean. That's another form of geoengineering. In other words, when you have jets that change the climate, that's another form of man-made geoengineering. So geoengineering means something that you're going to do in the atmosphere that would not normally be happening on any normal type of basis. In other words, a volcano would be normal. The particulates coming up from a volcano, for example, would be a normal phenomenon, and then we would take whatever consequences comes from that. However, when you start taking and talking about, as Holdren is, he's Obama's science advisor, talking about taking care of global warming, in other words, by putting particles in the air, like sulfur or some other particles, then that means that we're going to take some action where we're going to try to interfere with some normal processes that are going on. And the problem with this, for example, with sulfur, is that sulfur in the sense of it, we took it out of diesel fuel in California in 2006. And we said we have to clean it up because kids get asthma from sulfur, lots of health problems associated with too much sulfur in diesel fuel. We take it out of diesel fuel, and then someone comes along, like Paul Crutzen, and he says, we're going to put it up in the atmosphere to obscure the sunlight, so less sunlight reaches the earth, and therefore that will cool us down. But what about the health effects? If you have to take it out of diesel fuel, then my question is, why are you going to put up something that's not helpful into the atmosphere and try to change the process that we live under? And that's what geoengineering is. It's taking something and you're going to artificially induce something into our environment that's going to change for some reason. For example, stopping global warming or slowing it down. Let me go back to 2006 in November. NASA Ames in California had a meeting of geoengineers from all over the world. It was a big meeting. It went on for a week, and it was not open to the public. During the course of this meeting, they were talking about these different geoengineering projects that they were studying. These were university professors, different people, and there was many proposals that were put forward at this meeting. I was lucky enough to be present at the one-day public event that they had on this meeting, where several of the scientists and college professors spoke at this meeting with regard to geoengineering. One of the things we have on tape, because it was allowed to be videotaped, is that they were talking about the word geoengineering. And many of the geoengineering people in 2006 said that they had kept the word out of the public realm because they knew that if the public would find out about some of their schemes of putting chemicals into the air, to shooting salt into the air, all kinds of different experiments, that the public might say no. So they actually admitted that they kept the word geoengineering out of texts and out of, you can't find it in a lot of college textbooks at any lower level in high school, or you can't find it in undergraduate classes a lot of times in colleges. I found that to be true because I went back and looked. So what happened was the phrase was taken out, but a lot of scientists were getting money to study how they could interfere with the normal atmospheric conditions. So there was weather modification, there was planning to put chemicals or particles in the air. And so these schemes had been around for a long time, but they weren't really discussed in any public forum. They were discussed within their own cliquey group, essentially. I think that they're trying to begin to put it out to the public because they've been experimenting on it for a long time and they want to do more experiments and they need the funding. And one of the things that these geoengineers were talking about at their meeting that we heard is that they wanted to be able to take these programs forward, make them public so that they got more funding for experiments with these programs. This is the curiosity, though, is that they were talking about shooting up ocean water into the atmosphere, in other words, in salt particulates. And they knew from some experiments that salt particulates rain out quickly. Well, if you shoot salt particulates into clouds as a particulate to make it rain, when that cloud rains out over land, you're going to salt up your soils and make it unproductive for agriculture. You're going to salt up your drinking water sources. What they wanted to do was add other programs that they wanted to experiment on into the atmosphere to test their different hypotheses about their studies. And in this way, they would gain more university funding through the U.S. government, the Pentagon, whoever wanted to know, in other words, sponsor these studies. Private individuals could also contribute as well. So a whole culture had built up about how we can put things into the atmosphere to cool us down, and this is one of them. I went back and I knew from previous experience working within the California state government that all drinking water tests for every drinking water source in the state of California, now anything that's a winery, anything that's used for public consumption with so many people except for private wells, all drinking water sources, every district, every well, every producer of grapes who had a winery on his place and used well water, whatever it was, all had to test their water. And they have to do the tests that are required, hundreds of them, under the EPA. It occurred to me that if anything was being sprayed at any one time, if I could identify it, it might be showing up in drinking water tests. So there's a CD that's public, it's free of charge. Anyone can buy it. It's got about 18 million bytes of data on it. And you can go up and you can get one, or you can email the state. They'll send you one immediately within 3 or 4 days. And you can look at every drinking water test taken since 1972 in the state of California. I cannot tell you how many tests this amounts to, because every month, every week, they're taking tests all the time, all over the state, different utilities, different districts. I went back and looked at spreadsheets of every county, city, state, whatever, and I tried to determine from looking at all this data if there was anything that looked unusual. I found herbicides and pesticides where I expected to find them in the Central Valley, where they use a lot of herbicides and pesticides. So I kind of took those out. I looked at everything that I thought you would normally find downwind of a factory. After I got rid of all of those, I began to look at, was there anything showing up in all the drinking water spikes across California on a pretty consistent level? Initially, I looked for things like barium, aluminum, manganese, magnesium, calcium. I looked at what the pH of the water was to see if I could find any blips in pH. But what I discovered was that during the course of the year, starting in 1990, no less, that the water sources were all registering unusual spikes. Now, they weren't spiking just alone. Almost every water test in the state of California was showing spikes in a certain year and a certain month for certain of these chemicals. And I have a list of them, and I will be able to give them to you, but I was absolutely amazed and surprised about these spikes. And I said, what's going on? Why are these spikes occurring in almost all the drinking water sources all at the same time across the state of California? Now, sometimes wells would spike in a time distance if they had any type of, the water that would come down in rainfall or flooding would get into the well systems. Then you would show spikes later and not as high because of percolation problems. But we began to find these spikes. And it began to tell me that somebody somewhere was beginning to use inordinate amounts of arsenic, barium, aluminum, calcium, manganese, magnesium, and that all of these things, lead, iron, were all spiking at the same time. How can you have them spiking in the same time across the entire state of California when prior to the 1990s, and they were testing for these chemicals prior to the 1990s, that they weren't showing up in water systems at all, or they weren't spiking? And all of a sudden, way over state and federal standards, we found this data. A friend of mine took and graphed every single water district, every single piece of data, and we now have a graphing program so we can look at any water system in California, and we can determine if they were spiking in unison with any other water system across the state of California. It took 300 hours to write a program to do this. Monumental chore to do, but we now have it, and we can show you the graphs. We can show you the actual water data from the state and show that these are unusual spikes. My job then began to go and look at graphs that were provided by the California Air Resources Board. And what we discovered is that the spiking from the California Air Resources Board air tests were also spiking in the same years and at the same time, and coordinated with the spikings in the water supply, which led us to believe that this was something that was airborne and had to be hitting us from the air. Now, the California Air Resources Board